We look at how, where and why this slave trade began and the devastation it wreaked on Africans and their continent.
There was not a single spot of a continent that was out of reach of enslavers. It is more than the physical destruction of people. There was no hope for anyone for centuries.
So the consequences is the development of Africa, just because they chose the youngest and the strongest.
Slave trade that existed between the 16th and 19th centuries was as catastrophic as it was extensive. This is Ghana's Atlantic coast, and I've come here to give you a sense of just how many European nations were involved in the slave trade. There are more than 30 old slave trading forts along a 250-kilometre stretch of beach today, built by various European powers. Cape Coast Castle was built by the Swedes in 1653, but it changed hands 5 times over the next 11 years, ending with the British. Now, when the castle was originally built, it wasn't done very well. The roofs would leak, the ceilings were pretty dodgy, and the walls were quite insecure that they could even collapse. And so the whole castle was rebuilt in the mid-1770s. I want to point out something to you. Where those boys are going in is one of the male slave dungeons, and above it is what was a church. Today it's a library. So I just want you to reflect on that. Many meters below, a male slave dungeon, and above ground, a church which the European slave traders would worship at. Much has been written about the experience of enslaved Africans in Europe and the Americas, but less about what slavery meant for Africa. First, it's important to understand that the Europeans were not the first to trade in enslaved Africans. The Arabs had engaged in this centuries earlier on a massive scale across the continent, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. Also, Africans themselves had long practiced a form of slavery, using captives from battle as unpaid laborers, soldiers, or domestic servants. Cameroonian academic Professor Augustin Hole is president of the Scientific Committee of UNESCO's General History of Africa, on which this series bases its facts. He says Africans were treated very differently in indigenous slavery from how they were put to use in the transatlantic slave trade.
The main difference is that people were captive, were not sold. People were enslaved through war, through debt, but they were able to become included in the families of the captors. They were supposed to be taken care of. It doesn't mean that they have a wonderful life, but they couldn't be sold to somebody else. They were slaves of these families, and they were doing the work for this family. That's really the major difference. They were deprived of freedom, of course. They would have to work for the masters or for a mistress, but they were not a commodity.
But Professor Piri says indigenous slavery helped enable the transatlantic trade.
In fact, when you talk about what became the slave trade, it was something that was benefited from the internal African slavery itself, the system as it existed, because those are people that became the first targets of people to be sold as slaves, because it was difficult to sell people from your own village as slaves. So it was these people that had been conquered because they were weak, and then you easily sell them.
Ghanaian professors Akosua Perbi and Essie Sutherland Addy are two of the most prominent academics in Africa on slavery.
There's always been an indigenous internal aspect of slavery, and then there's been an external aspect of slavery. And the indigenous aspect had to do with the need for labor. mainly for the farms, for the mines, for the fisher folk, and so on. And then also what made the indigenous slavery a bit peculiar was that people also needed slaves as wives. There were slave markets. Women always fetched a higher price than men, you know, and they would marry the women, have children with them, and the children became part of the family. And what I found in my research